Miguel Santos wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked at the roses he had just finished pruning. After 15 years working on the Blackstone estate, he knew every flower, every tree, and every inch of the massive property like it was his own backyard. The morning sun was getting stronger, and he could already tell it was going to be another hot day in California. He walked over to his small tool shed and carefully cleaned his pruning shears. Miguel took pride in keeping his tools spotless, just like he took pride in keeping the gardens perfect. The other workers sometimes teased him about being so careful, but Miguel didn't mind. This job meant everything to him and his family. "Morning, Miguel," called out Rosa, one of the housekeepers, as she walked past carrying fresh linens. "Those roses look beautiful today." Miguel smiled and waved back. "Thank you, Rosa. I replanted some of them last month. Lady Blackstone wanted more color near the pool area." Rosa nodded and continued toward the main house. Miguel watched her go, then looked up at the enormous mansion where the Blackstone family lived. It was bigger than his entire neighborhood back home, with tall windows that sparkled in the sunlight and white columns that made it look like something from a movie. Miguel had started working here when he was just 25 years old. Back then, his English wasn't very good, and he was nervous about everything. But the previous head gardener, an older man named Tony, had been patient with him. Tony taught him not just about plants and landscaping, but about how things worked on an estate like this. "Remember, Miguel," Tony used to say, "we're not just employees here, we're caretakers. These people trust us with their home." Now Miguel was the head gardener himself, managing a team of 6 other workers. He had learned to speak English well, and he understood the routines of the big house. He knew that Lady Blackstone liked her morning coffee on the terrace overlooking the rose garden. He knew that she had her book club meetings every Tuesday afternoon, and that she always wanted the flowers in the main entrance to be changed twice a week. Miguel also knew that Lady Blackstone could be difficult. She was a woman in her 70s who had very specific ideas about how everything should look. Sometimes she would change her mind about something 3 times in one day, but Miguel had learned to be patient with her, just like Tony had taught him. The money Miguel earned from this job supported his entire family. His wife Carmen worked part-time at a local grocery store, but most of their income came from Miguel's steady paycheck. They had 3 children: David, who was 26 and worked at a landscaping company across town; Maria, who was in her 2nd year of college studying to be a teacher; and little Luis, who was only 8 and loved to help Miguel in their small garden at home. Miguel had been saving money for years, hoping to eventually start his own landscaping business. He had a notebook where he wrote down ideas and drew pictures of garden designs. Sometimes, when he was working alone in the quiet parts of the estate, he would imagine what it would be like to have his own clients and create beautiful spaces from scratch. But those dreams felt far away on this particular Tuesday morning. Miguel had noticed some strange tension around the estate lately. The other staff members seemed nervous, whispering to each other in corners and stopping their conversations when he walked by. Even Rosa, who was usually cheerful and chatty, seemed worried about something. Around 11 o'clock, Miguel was working near the main house, trimming the hedges that lined the driveway. The windows were open because of the warm weather, and he could hear voices inside. Someone was talking loudly, but he couldn't make out the words. He tried not to listen. Tony had always told him to mind his own business and focus on his work. His lunch break came at noon, like always. Miguel walked to the small break area behind the maintenance building, where the staff usually ate their meals. He sat on an old wooden bench and unwrapped the sandwich Carmen had made for him that morning. As he ate, he thought about David, his oldest son. David had been asking Miguel to teach him more about the business side of landscaping. The young man was good with his hands and had a natural talent for design, but he wanted to understand how to price jobs and manage customers. Miguel was proud that his son was interested in following in his footsteps, maybe even helping him start that business someday. After lunch, Miguel walked back toward his work area, passing close to the main house again. He needed to get some fertilizer from the storage room, which was located near the side entrance that the staff usually used. As he walked, he saw Mr. Peterson, the head of security, talking seriously with 2 other men in suits near the front door. Miguel didn't think much of it. Rich people like the Blackstones had security meetings all the time. They worried about everything from burglars to photographers trying to take pictures of their property. Miguel just nodded politely to Mr. Peterson and continued on his way. But something felt different that afternoon. When Miguel tried to make small talk with Carlos, one of the younger gardeners, the man barely looked at him. When Miguel asked Rosa if everything was okay, she just shook her head and hurried away. Even his supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, who managed all the household staff, seemed to be avoiding him. It wasn't until almost closing time that Miguel understood what was happening. Mrs. Henderson approached him as he was putting his tools away for the day. She looked uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be having this conversation. "Miguel, I need you to come with me to the office," she said quietly. "Is everything okay?" Miguel asked. "Did I do something wrong with the gardens?" Mrs. Henderson didn't answer. She just led him to the small office building where the estate's administrative work was done. Inside, Mr. Peterson was waiting with one of the men in suits from earlier. Miguel's stomach started to feel tight. "Miguel," Mr. Peterson began, "we need to ask you some questions about yesterday." "Yesterday?" Miguel repeated. "What about yesterday?" The man in the suit opened a folder and pulled out some papers. "Some valuable jewelry is missing from Lady Blackstone's bedroom. Items worth several $1,000s. We're talking to all the staff members who had access to that area of the house." Miguel felt confused. "But I don't go into the house. I only work in the gardens." "According to our records," Mr. Peterson said, looking at his papers, "you were seen near the main house during your lunch break yesterday, near the windows that were open on the first floor." "I was trimming the hedges," Miguel explained. "That's my job. I always work near the house." The questions continued for almost an hour. They asked Miguel about his schedule, about where he had been at different times, about whether he had seen anything unusual. Miguel answered everything honestly, but he could tell that they didn't believe him. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke up. "Miguel, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to let you go." The words hit Miguel like a punch to the stomach. "Let me go? You mean fired?" "The missing items are very valuable," the man in the suit said. "Lady Blackstone is very upset. We can't take any chances." Miguel felt the room spinning around him. 15 years of faithful service. 15 years of perfect gardens and never missing a day of work. 15 years of being trusted with keys and tools and responsibility. "But I didn't take anything," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I would never steal. You know me." Mrs. Henderson looked sad, but she shook her head. "I'm sorry, Miguel. The decision has been made. Please clean out your things and turn in your keys." As Miguel walked to his tool shed one last time, his hands were shaking. How would he tell Carmen? How would he explain to the children that Daddy had lost his job because people thought he was a thief? How would he find another job when word got around about what had happened? He packed his personal tools into a small box, said goodbye to the roses he had nurtured for so many years, and walked toward the gate for the last time. Behind him, the beautiful gardens he had created continued to bloom in the afternoon sun, as if nothing had changed at all. Richard Blackstone stood at the front gate of his childhood home, staring at the massive iron bars that separated him from the estate. It had been 12 years since he had last set foot on this property. 12 years since the big fight with his mother that had torn their family apart forever. The lawyer had called him 3 days ago with the news. "Mr. Blackstone, I'm sorry to inform you that your mother passed away in her sleep. As her only living relative, you'll need to come and handle the estate matters." Richard had felt numb when he heard those words. Not sad, not relieved, just empty. He and his mother had said terrible things to each other during their last conversation, things that could never be taken back. And now she was gone, and there would never be a chance to make things right. He pressed the code into the security keypad, surprised that it still worked after all these years. The gate swung open with a soft electronic hum, and Richard drove his black Tesla up the familiar driveway. The gardens looked different somehow. Not bad, just different from how he remembered them. Someone had clearly been taking good care of the property. The house looked exactly the same, though. Same white columns, same enormous front door, same feeling that it was more like a museum than a home. Richard parked his car and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. He was a successful man now, worth more than his mother had ever been, but being here still made him feel like a disappointed child. His phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant back in San Francisco. "The board meeting has been moved to Thursday. Do you need me to reschedule anything else?" Richard typed back quickly. "Handle everything. I'll be here for a few days." He grabbed his overnight bag and walked to the front door. The housekeeper, an older woman he didn't recognize, had left the keys under a flower pot as the lawyer had arranged. Richard let himself into the house and immediately felt overwhelmed by the smell of his mother's perfume still lingering in the air. Everything was exactly as he remembered it. The same expensive furniture, the same paintings on the walls, the same cold feeling that had made him want to escape this place as soon as he turned 18. His mother had kept the house like a shrine to her own taste, never changing anything, never letting it feel warm or lived in. Richard dropped his bag in the front hallway and walked slowly through the rooms. The kitchen where the cook used to make him breakfast before school. The library where he used to hide and read books about faraway places. The living room where his mother would entertain her wealthy friends, always reminding Richard to be quiet and well-behaved. But it was walking into his mother's bedroom that really hit him. This had been her private space, the one room in the house where she would let her guard down just a little bit. Richard saw her reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her slippers were neatly placed beside the bed, as if she might come back and put them on at any moment. The lawyer had told Richard that he needed to go through his mother's personal belongings and decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to throw away. It seemed like such a cold way to summarize someone's entire life, but Richard didn't know where else to start. He opened the first dresser drawer and found it full of silk scarves, all perfectly folded and organized by color. His mother had always been obsessed with organization. Everything in its place, everything according to her rules. Richard remembered how she used to lecture him about keeping his room clean, about putting things back where they belonged. The second drawer was full of old photographs. Richard picked up a few and looked at them. Pictures of his mother as a young woman before she had married his father. Pictures of family vacations from when Richard was small, back when they had still been happy sometimes. There was even a picture of Richard's college graduation which surprised him. He didn't think his mother had kept anything that reminded her of their better days. At the bottom of the drawer, Richard found a small wooden jewelry box that he had never seen before. It was plain and simple, nothing like the expensive jewelry his mother usually wore. When he opened it, he found a collection of what looked like cheaper pieces. Costume jewelry, sentimental items, things that were probably more meaningful than valuable. Richard was about to close the box when something caught his eye. In the corner, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, was a silver pendant on a thin chain. When he unwrapped it and held it up to the light, his heart stopped beating. It was a Celtic knot design about the size of a quarter, with intricate curves and patterns that seemed to flow into each other endlessly. But what made Richard's hands start shaking was the tiny inscription on the back. "Forever in my heart, Dad." Richard sat down hard on his mother's bed, staring at the pendant in disbelief. It was impossible. This exact pendant was supposed to be lost forever, buried somewhere in the wilderness of Northern California, where no one would ever find it. 20 years ago, when Richard's son David was just 6 years old, they had gone on a camping trip together. It was supposed to be a special father-son adventure, just the two of them bonding in the mountains. Richard had bought the pendant for David just before they left, telling him it was a symbol of how they would always be connected, no matter what. David had loved that pendant. He wore it every day and would touch it whenever he felt scared or lonely. "It's like having a piece of your heart with me, Daddy," David had said in his sweet little boy voice. The camping trip had started out perfectly. They hiked during the day, roasted marshmallows over the campfire at night, and David asked a million questions about everything they saw. Richard had felt like he was finally being the kind of father he had always wanted to be, so different from his own cold, distant parents. But on the third day, everything went wrong. They were hiking near a stream when David said he needed to use the bathroom. Richard told him to go behind some trees and be quick about it. When David didn't come back after 10 minutes, Richard started calling his name. After 20 minutes, Richard was running through the forest, shouting until his voice was hoarse. The search lasted for weeks. Police, forest rangers, volunteers, search dogs, helicopters. Richard hired private investigators and offered a massive reward for any information. He put up missing posters all over California and beyond. But David had simply vanished as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The guilt had nearly destroyed Richard. If only he had gone with David to the bathroom. If only he had been watching more carefully. If only he had chosen a different campsite, a different day, a different activity entirely. The if-onlys haunted him every single day. The disappearance had also destroyed Richard's marriage. His wife blamed him for losing their son, and Richard blamed himself too. They tried counseling, they tried having another child. They tried moving to a different city to start fresh. But the pain was too big and too deep. Eventually, they divorced and Richard threw himself into his work, building his tech company into a billion-dollar empire as a way to avoid dealing with his broken heart. Richard had never told his mother about David's disappearance. By that time, he and his mother were already fighting constantly about his career choices and his lifestyle. She thought his tech company was a waste of time compared to the family's traditional investments. She thought his wife wasn't good enough for the Blackstone name. Richard had decided that his mother didn't deserve to know about David, didn't deserve to share in his grief or be part of his pain. But now, somehow, his mother had possessed David's pendant, the one piece of his lost son that Richard thought was gone forever. He turned the pendant over and over in his hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, remembering how David's small fingers used to trace the Celtic patterns. How was this possible? Where had his mother gotten it? Had she somehow known about David all along? Had David found his way back to California? Was he still alive? Richard felt tears streaming down his face as he clutched the pendant tightly. For the first time in 20 years, he felt a tiny spark of hope flickering in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this impossible discovery was the beginning of getting his son back. Richard sat on his mother's bed for nearly an hour, just staring at the pendant in his hands. His mind was racing with 1,000 questions, but one thought kept pushing through all the others. He had to find out where this pendant came from. If there was even the smallest chance that David was alive somewhere, Richard would move heaven and earth to find him. He wiped his eyes and stood up, feeling more determined than he had in years. His mother had always been incredibly organized, keeping detailed records of everything she bought, sold, or gave away. If she had acquired this pendant recently, there would be a paper trail somewhere in the house. Richard started with his mother's desk in the study, a massive oak piece that had belonged to his grandfather. The drawers were filled with file folders, each one labeled in his mother's neat handwriting. Insurance, taxes, medical, household expenses, everything was sorted and categorized just like Richard remembered from his childhood. He pulled out the folder marked Recent Purchases and began going through the receipts and invoices. Most of them were for ordinary things: groceries, dry cleaning, prescription medications, flowers for the garden. But then, near the bottom of the stack, Richard found something that made his pulse quicken. It was a receipt from Golden State Pawn and Jewelry, dated just 5 days before his mother's death. The handwritten description read, "Sterling silver pendant, Celtic design, and the price was $300. At the bottom, someone had written in pen, "Beautiful piece, customer said it was a family heirloom." Richard's hands were shaking as he read the receipt over and over again. His mother had bought David's pendant from a pawn shop less than a week before she died. That meant someone had sold it recently, someone who might know what happened to David. He grabbed his phone and searched for the pawn shop's address. It was located about 20 minutes away, in a part of town that his mother would never normally visit. Richard couldn't understand why she would have gone there of all places. His mother had always shopped at expensive jewelry stores downtown, places where she knew the owners personally. The drive to the pawn shop felt like the longest 20 minutes of Richard's life. He kept imagining different scenarios. Maybe David had grown up and was living nearby. Maybe he had needed money and sold the pendant without realizing its significance. Maybe he was in trouble and needed cash quickly. Richard tried not to think about the darker possibilities. Golden State Pawn and Jewelry was located in a strip mall between a taco restaurant and a dry cleaner. It wasn't the kind of place Richard ever would have expected to find his mother. The building was old and needed paint, with barred windows and a neon sign that flickered slightly. Richard parked his Tesla and sat for a moment, trying to calm his nerves. Through the window, he could see display cases full of watches, rings, and musical instruments. A bell chimed when he opened the door, and the smell of old leather and metal polish filled his nostrils. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes. He looked up from the inventory sheet he was working on and smiled. "Afternoon." I'm Frank. What can I help you with today? Richard pulled out the receipt and placed it on the counter. I'm hoping you can tell me about this pendant that was sold here last week. It was bought by my mother, but she passed away before I could ask her about it. Frank picked up the receipt and studied it carefully. His expression changed slightly, becoming more serious. Oh yes, I remember this piece. Very unusual design, really beautiful work. Your mother seemed quite taken with it. Can you tell me anything about the person who sold it to you? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Frank hesitated for a moment. Well, normally we don't share information about our customers, but given the circumstances. He looked at Richard more closely. You know, now that I think about it, you look a bit like the young man who brought it in. Same eyes, same jawline. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Can you describe him? He was probably in his mid-20s, tall, dark hair. Nice kid, very polite. He seemed really sad about having to sell the pendant. Kept saying it was important to his family, but that he needed the money for something urgent. Frank paused, studying Richard's face. He said his name was David. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. David, are you sure? Pretty sure, yeah. He signed the paperwork. Frank pulled out a large ledger book and flipped through several pages. Here it is. David Santos. He left an address too, though I'm not sure if it's current. Richard stared at the signature on the page. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but seeing his son's name written there felt surreal. Santos, that wasn't his last name. Frank looked confused. Maybe he was adopted? Or maybe he got married. I don't really know the family history. He just said it had belonged to his father and that he hated to part with it. Did he say anything else about his father? About his family? Not much. He mentioned that his dad was going through a tough time and needed help with some medical bills. The kid seemed really worried about him. Frank closed the ledger and looked at Richard sympathetically. I'm sorry for your loss, by the way. Your mother seemed like a lovely lady. She spent a long time looking at that pendant before she decided to buy it. Richard felt overwhelmed with questions, but one was more urgent than the others. Do you have security cameras in here? Sure do. We have to, in this business. Why? Would you still have footage from when David sold the pendant? I know it's a lot to ask, but this is incredibly important to me. Frank thought for a moment. That was just over a week ago, so yeah, we should still have it. Our system keeps recordings for 30 days. He paused, looking at Richard with curiosity. Can I ask why this pendant means so much to you? Richard took a deep breath. He had kept David's disappearance secret for so long, but now he felt like he had to tell someone. That pendant belonged to my son. He disappeared 20 years ago when he was 6 years old. I thought I'd never see it again. Frank's expression changed completely. Oh my God. You think the young man who sold it might be your son? I don't know what to think, but I have to find out. Frank nodded immediately. Of course. Let me get the footage pulled up. He disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a laptop computer. Here we go. This is from last Tuesday afternoon. Richard watched the screen as Frank scrolled through the security footage. The camera showed a clear view of the counter area from above. Frank fast-forwarded through several hours of routine transactions until he stopped at a timestamp that matched the receipt. Here, Frank said quietly. This is him. Richard looked at the screen and felt the world tilt around him. The young man standing at the counter was tall and had dark hair, just like Frank had described. But it was his face that made Richard's breath catch in his throat. The shape of his eyes, the way he held his head slightly to one side when he was thinking. The nervous habit of running his hand through his hair. All of it was achingly familiar. It was like looking at a video of himself from 30 years ago, but it was also unmistakably different. This young man had features that reminded Richard of his ex-wife, expressions that belonged to the little boy who used to ask for one more bedtime story. Can you play it again? Richard whispered. Frank restarted the video. This time, Richard watched every detail. The way David carefully unwrapped the pendant from a piece of cloth. The reluctance in his movements as he placed it on the counter. The conversation with Frank, where Richard could see David's mouth moving but couldn't hear the words. The moment when David signed the paperwork, then picked up the cash and looked back at the pendant one last time before leaving. That's him, Richard said, his voice breaking. That's my son. Frank stared at Richard in amazement. Are you serious? After 20 years? I'd know him anywhere. He looks just like I did at that age. Richard felt tears streaming down his face, but he didn't care. "Can you give me that address he left?" Frank wrote down the address on a piece of paper and handed it to Richard. "I really hope you find him, and I hope everything works out okay." Richard thanked Frank and rushed back to his car, his mind spinning with possibilities. David was alive. David was here in California using the last name Santos. David had sold the pendant to help someone with medical bills. As Richard drove toward the address Frank had given him, he tried to prepare himself for what he might find. What if David didn't remember him? What if David didn't want to be found? What if the address was wrong or old? But for the first time in 20 years, Richard allowed himself to hope. His son was alive, and he was about to try to bring him home. Richard drove through the winding streets of East San Jose, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The address Frank had given him led to a neighborhood he had never visited before, full of small houses with chain-link fences and gardens that were clearly cared for, but not professionally maintained. He pulled up to 347 Maple Street and sat in his car for a moment, staring at the modest single-story house. The front yard had a few rose bushes and a small vegetable garden. There was an older pickup truck in the driveway and children's toys scattered on the front porch. It looked like the kind of place where a real family lived, so different from the cold mansion where Richard had grown up. His heart was pounding as he walked up the concrete path to the front door. What would he say? How do you introduce yourself to the son you lost 20 years ago? What if David didn't believe him? What if David didn't want anything to do with him? Before he could lose his nerve, Richard knocked on the door. After a few moments, it opened to reveal a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing an apron that said "World's Best Mom" and had flour on her hands. "Can I help you?" she asked politely, though Richard could see she was curious about why a man in an expensive suit was standing on her doorstep. "I'm sorry to bother you," Richard began, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm looking for David Santos. I believe he lives here." The woman's expression became more guarded. "David is my son. Is he in some kind of trouble?" No trouble. My name is Richard Blackstone. I think David might be my son too." The woman stared at him in confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" Richard realized how crazy he must sound. "I know this is hard to believe, but I think David was my son when he was little. He disappeared when he was 6 years old, and I've been looking for him ever since." The woman stepped back, her hand still on the door. "That's impossible. David has been our son since he was 6. We adopted him legally." "Adopted?" Richard's heart began racing even faster. "Where did you adopt him from?" "From the state. He was found lost in the mountains, couldn't remember his family or his real name. He had trauma from whatever happened to him." The woman paused, studying Richard's face more carefully. "Who did you say you were?" "Richard Blackstone. David disappeared during a camping trip 20 years ago. He was wearing a silver pendant with a Celtic design when he went missing." The woman's face went completely pale. "Oh my God, Carmen! Carmen, come here right now!" Another woman appeared from inside the house, this one younger and also looking concerned. "What's wrong, Mama?" "This man says he's David's father. His biological father." Carmen looked at Richard with wide eyes. "That's impossible. David doesn't remember anything from before we found him." "But he had a pendant," Richard said urgently. "A silver pendant with Celtic knots. He sold it at a pawn shop last week." Both women went silent. Finally, the older woman spoke. "You'd better come inside. I think we need to talk." Richard followed them into a living room that was warm and comfortable, filled with family photos and children's artwork hanging on the walls. He could see pictures of David at different ages, growing from a small confused boy into the young man Richard had seen on the security footage. "My name is Carmen Santos," the younger woman said. "David is my husband, and this is my mother-in-law Isabel. David's father is Miguel Santos." "Where is Miguel?" Richard asked. Carmen and Isabel exchanged a sad look. "He's resting in the back bedroom. He's been very sick since he lost his job 3 months ago. The stress and depression have been terrible for his health." Richard felt a cold feeling creeping into his stomach. "What kind of job did he lose?" "He was a gardener," Isabel said quietly. "Worked for 15 years at some big estate, taking care of their property. Then they accused him of stealing jewelry and fired him. No one will hire him now because word got around." The pieces began falling into place in Richard's mind and he felt sick. What estate? Do you remember the name? Blackstone, Carmen said bitterly. Some rich family called Blackstone. They destroyed my father-in-law's reputation over some jewelry that probably wasn't even stolen. Richard felt the room spinning around him. Miguel Santos. The gardener his mother had fired. The man who had been accused of stealing his mother's jewelry. The man who had actually been raising Richard's son for the past 20 years. Oh God, Richard whispered, putting his head in his hands. Oh God, what have we done? What are you talking about? Carmen asked. Richard looked up at both women, tears streaming down his face. That was my mother's estate. Lady Blackstone was my mother. Miguel was fired because my mother thought he stole some jewelry. But she actually bought it from a pawn shop. She bought David's pendant, the one Miguel's son sold to help pay for medical bills. The silence in the room was deafening. Isabel sat down heavily in a chair, while Carmen just stared at Richard in disbelief. You're telling me, Carmen said slowly, that your family destroyed my husband's father over jewelry that wasn't even stolen? And now you're here saying that my husband is actually your son? I know how it sounds. I know it's crazy. But I saw the security footage of David selling the pendant. I'd know his face anywhere. He looks exactly like I did when I was his age. David doesn't remember anything from before he was 6, Isabel said quietly. When they found him in the mountains, he was traumatized and confused. He couldn't tell them his name or where he came from. The doctor said his memory might come back eventually, but it never did. That's because he was only 6 when he got lost, Richard explained. We were on a camping trip in Northern California. I told him to go behind some trees for a few minutes, and when he didn't come back, I searched everywhere. The police searched for weeks. I hired private investigators. I never stopped looking for him. Carmen was crying now. Miguel saved him. My father-in-law found David wandering along a road near our house, cold and scared and alone. Miguel and Mama Isabel took him in, fed him, got him medical attention. When no one claimed him, they adopted him and raised him like their own son. Richard felt a wave of gratitude mixed with overwhelming guilt. Miguel saved my son's life, and then my mother destroyed his life over a misunderstanding. Where is David now? Richard asked. At work, Carmen said. He's doing landscaping jobs around town, trying to make extra money for Miguel's medical bills. That's why he sold the pendant. He hated to do it, but Papa Miguel needed medication and we didn't have the money. Richard stood up suddenly. I have to see him. I have to see David, and I have to talk to Miguel. I have to make this right somehow. Isabel looked at him with both sadness and hope in her eyes. Miguel doesn't even know that David sold the pendant. David didn't want him to feel guilty about it. What's David's work schedule? Richard asked. When will he be home? He usually gets home around 6, Carmen said. But Mr. Blackstone, you have to understand something. David has been our son for 20 years. Miguel and Isabel are the only parents he's ever known. Whatever happens here, that's not going to change. Richard nodded, wiping his eyes. I understand. I'm not here to take him away from his family. I'm here to thank the people who saved my son's life. And I'm here to try to fix the terrible mistake my family made. He paused, looking around the modest living room filled with photos of the family that had raised his lost boy. Can I wait here until David comes home? I think it's time for all of us to learn the truth. Carmen and Isabel looked at each other, then back at Richard. Finally, Isabel nodded. You can wait, she said quietly. But first, I think you should meet Miguel. I think you should see what your mother's accusations did to the man who saved your son. Isabel led Richard down a narrow hallway lined with family photos. Richard could see David growing up in these pictures. First day of school, birthday parties, soccer games, graduation. 20 years of memories that should have belonged to Richard but instead belonged to this family who had loved and cared for his lost son. They stopped at a bedroom door, and Isabel knocked gently. Miguel, there's someone here who wants to meet you. A weak voice answered from inside. I'm not feeling well today, Mama. Can it wait? Isabel looked at Richard, then back at the door. I think this is important, mi amor, please. After a moment, they heard movement inside the room. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s who looked much older than his years. Miguel Santos was thin and pale, wearing an old robe over his pajamas. His hair was mostly gray now, and his eyes looked tired and sad. But when he saw Richard standing in the hallway, something flickered in his expression. Do I know you? Miguel asked quietly. Richard's throat felt tight. This was the man who had saved his son's life, and Richard's family had destroyed him. My name is Richard Blackstone. I think we need to talk. Miguel's face went completely white. He gripped the door frame to steady himself. Blackstone? You're related to that woman who accused me of stealing? She was my mother, Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. And I'm here to tell you that you never stole anything. My mother bought that jewelry from a pawn shop. You were innocent. Miguel stared at him for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. It doesn't matter now. My reputation is ruined. No one will hire me. I'm too sick to work anyway. Please, Richard said. Can we sit down? I have something incredible to tell you. Isabel helped Miguel to a chair in the living room, and Richard sat across from him. Carmen joined them, still looking shocked by everything that was happening. 20 years ago, Richard began, I lost my 6-year-old son during a camping trip. His name was David, and he was wearing a silver pendant when he disappeared. I searched for him everywhere, but I never found him. Miguel listened quietly, but Richard could see confusion in his eyes. Last week, Richard continued, someone sold that pendant to a pawn shop. My mother bought it just before she died. When I found it among her things, I traced it back to the shop and discovered that the person who sold it was named David Santos. Miguel's eyes widened slightly. David, my David? Your David was my David first. But you saved him, Miguel. You found him and raised him and loved him. You gave him a family when I couldn't find him to bring him home. Miguel sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. David was found wandering on the road near our house. He was so small and scared. He couldn't remember his name or where he came from. We took him to the police, to the hospitals, but no one knew who he belonged to. The trauma made him forget, Richard explained. But I never forgot him. I've been looking for him every day for 20 years. Carmen was crying quietly. David doesn't know any of this. He thinks his memories just never came back because he was too young. Where is he now? Richard asked. He should be home any minute, Isabel said, looking at the clock on the wall. He's been working so hard to pay for Miguel's medical bills. That's why he sold your pendant. He felt terrible about it, but he didn't know what else to do. Richard felt his heart breaking all over again. His son had sacrificed something precious to help the man who had raised him, and that man was the same person Richard's family had wronged. Miguel, Richard said, leaning forward, I can't undo what my mother did to you, but I can try to make it right. I can clear your name. I can make sure everyone knows you were innocent, and I can help with David's medical bills. Miguel shook his head weakly. I don't want your charity. It's not charity. It's what I owe you for saving my son's life and raising him to be a good man. Before Miguel could respond, they heard the front door open. I'm home, called a familiar voice. Richard's entire body tensed. After 20 years, he was about to see his son again. David walked into the living room, still wearing his work clothes and carrying a lunchbox. He was tall and strong, with calloused hands from years of outdoor work. When he saw Richard sitting with his family, he stopped and looked confused. Who's this? David asked. Carmen stood up and walked over to her husband. David, you need to sit down. We have something important to tell you. David looked around the room at everyone's serious faces. Is Papa Miguel okay? Did something happen? I'm fine, mijo, Miguel said gently. But this man has some news about your past, about who you were before you came to live with us. David sat down slowly, still looking confused. Richard studied his son's face, seeing the little boy he remembered mixed with the man David had become. He could see his own features there, but also the kindness and strength that the Santos family had nurtured. David, Richard began, his voice shaking. My name is Richard Blackstone. 20 years ago, I lost my son during a camping trip. His name was David, and he was 6 years old when he disappeared. David's expression didn't change much. Okay? I'm sorry that happened to you, but I don't understand what that has to do with me. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver pendant. When David saw it, his face went completely pale. How do you have that? David whispered. I sold that last week. You sold it to help pay for Miguel's medical bills, Richard said. My mother bought it from the pawn shop. And when I found it after she died, I realized that you're my son. You're the little boy I lost 20 years ago. David stared at the pendant, then looked at Richard's face, then back at the pendant. That's impossible. My parents found me when I was lost. I don't remember anything before that. You were traumatized, Richard explained gently. The doctor said memory loss was normal for children who go through something like that. But this pendant proves who you are. I gave it to you just before our camping trip. David stood up suddenly and began pacing around the room. This is crazy. This is impossible. Miguel and Isabel are my parents. This is my family. They are your family, Richard said quickly. They raised you and loved you and took care of you. I'm not here to take you away from them. I'm here to thank them for saving your life. Miguel spoke up from his chair. David, look at his face. Really look at him. David stopped pacing and stared at Richard. After a long moment, recognition began to dawn in his eyes. Oh my God, we do look alike. You look exactly like I did when I was your age, Richard said. You have your mother's smile, though. My ex-wife. She would be so happy to know you're alive. David sat back down, looking overwhelmed. So you're saying that Miguel isn't my real father? He's your real father in every way that matters, Richard said firmly. He found you when you were lost and scared. He fed you and clothed you and sent you to school. He taught you how to work with your hands and how to be a good man. I may have given you life, but Miguel gave you a childhood. Miguel was crying now. David, you will always be my son, no matter what. David went over to Miguel and knelt beside his chair. And you'll always be my papa. That will never change. Richard watched this exchange and felt both heartbroken and grateful. He had lost 20 years with his son, but David had been loved and cared for by people who were clearly wonderful parents. There's something else, Richard said. Miguel, you were fired from your job because my mother thought you stole some jewelry. But you didn't steal anything. She bought David's pendant from the pawn shop, not knowing what it was. You were innocent, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Over the next few hours, they all talked and cried, and tried to understand how their lives had become so tangled together. Richard learned about David's childhood, his marriage to Carmen, his love for the family that had raised him. David learned about his biological parents and the camping trip that had changed everything. As the evening went on, Richard made some phone calls. He contacted the estate manager and had Miguel's name cleared officially. He called his lawyers and had them prepare a settlement for the wrongful termination. He arranged for Miguel to see the best doctors his money could buy, but most importantly, he got to know his son again. Not as the 6-year-old boy he had lost, but as the 26-year-old man David had become. A man who was kind and hardworking and devoted to his family. A man who had been shaped by the love and values of Miguel and Isabel Santos. When it was time for Richard to leave that night, David walked him to his car. This is all really overwhelming, David said. I don't know how to process it yet. Take all the time you need, Richard replied. I've waited 20 years to find you. I can wait a little longer for you to figure out what this means. David held out his hand and Richard shook it. Maybe we could have coffee sometime? I'd like to hear more about the camping trip. And about my biological mother. Richard felt tears in his eyes again. I would love that. As Richard drove away from the Santos house, he looked back and saw David standing in the doorway, waving goodbye. In his hand, David was holding the silver pendant, not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of the connections that bind families together, even across 20 years in the greatest of misunderstandings. Richard had found his son. But more than that, he had found the family who had saved David's life and raised him with love. And now finally he could begin to heal the wounds that had been hurting for so very long.